Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more automation, the Car Company Tycoon game, continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 1986. In the last couple of videos, I focused on engine builds, which is a little outside the norm of what I usually do, which I usually do the engine build for a model, and then I do the car build right after that. But I took a little bit of break from the car builder because there was a lot of bugs with the car builder, especially with that tire tab and getting the tires to be set up the way you wanted to get them to set up without too much hassle. So I kind of took a break from it for a little bit. Since then, though, we've had the update actually come live for everyone, whether they were in the open beta or not, as well as a week later, there was a patch to that. And it looks like a lot of the bugs that we were having were fixed since then. I'm not 100% sure if the tire tab is fixed, but I think it may be. It looked like it was responding okay. And what I did, just to make sure everything was working okay, so I went ahead and I did the car build off camera, did everything, and we're going to go ahead and pop in here and revise this. So we have the standard 1.6 M trim, which is a 1.6 liter engine with a manual transmission. Let's go ahead and look at that. There's going to be quite a bit to talk about in this video, so it's going to be a little bit longer, and I apologize for that. But there's a couple things I want to talk about. First off, this build was kind of a learning experience for me. When I looked at these numbers, and especially the drivability number that I see here, was 44.7. I was actually a little confused by that. Because in previous versions of the Luna, especially the 1981 version, I got a little above 50 with that drivability, and I was kind of puzzled. And I ended up, while I was doing this build, I ended up going back to that 1981 Edison Luna and looking at things because I was really curious why there was such a difference. And when I was looking at things, and I was just like checking what the settings were and why things were so different, I noticed that it all of a sudden just did a recalculation of all the stats, and I didn't change anything, and it went from being a little above 50 to dropping down all the way down to 43. So it seems like there have been a lot of changes with the way calculations are being done in this game and how we derive our stats. So that's one thing I can take away from this. So if you are looking at some of your older builds with the last version, you may see a parity with the stats that you're getting with this new version and what you are getting with those older versions. So you may have to recalculate those older versions to get the numbers to be to match up. Now, I did that with all the trims of the 81 Edison Luna. I don't know if I'm going to be doing that with the other trims in the future. Now, some of that I've expected because we had the brake pad set up actually having an effect on your brake fade. And that since, I built the Edison Luna, which was built in the previous version of the game. And I did notice that did have an effect on the older Edison Luna. The brake fade was a lot worse. But what I ended up doing is I ended up taking the brake pads, which were more comfort-oriented, and giving them a more neutral setup for that 81 Luna. But I didn't do any other changes. And still, the brake fade was, I think, a lot worse than it was before. And obviously, as I said, there was the drop in stats. So all of those drop in stats weren't accounted for just with that brake pad change. So that is one thing to take away from that. So let's go ahead and look at what we have in entirety, because I know I did most of this off camera. So the body ended up choosing, let's see if we can find it in this, was this body here, but I went with the four-door sedan version of it. And styling-wise, I kind of went with a blocky styling. I'm not so sure if I'm sold on the color. It ended up being a little too urine yellow there. But I was trying to go with kind of a duller yellow there, maybe a little bit more of a plasticky look, which is kind of the look I'm going for, with a duller plasticky look and making it blocky for the 80s period. But let's go ahead and look around at the styling there just briefly here. And let's go ahead and go forward to the chassis. Now I keep getting this message pop up, and I'm not exactly sure why it pops up or what it means, but it doesn't seem to have any effect on the trims or anything, so I pretty much have been ignoring it. In any case, we've got a monocoque chassis, corrosion-resistant steel, front longitudinal setup, McPherson strut, semi-trailing arm, and a steel body panel. Now, I did try and do a transverse setup just to, see how things are, but fortunately, just as before, front transverse setups just don't fit, and that's because they use the same gearbox, the same longitudinal gearbox, whether it's longitudinally mounted or transverse mounted. And transverse mounted engines have definitely different gearbox setups than longitudinally mounted engines, and the fact that the developers haven't caught on this is a real problem. It kind of surprises me a little bit, but it definitely makes it very difficult to do a lot of front-wheel drive builds unless you're using really, really, really tiny engines. I mean, this is a 1.6 liter engine, and it still doesn't fit. But as I said, I've already discussed that, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. Now, we already looked at the fixture, so let's just pop ahead, and we see that I set it up for longitudinal rear-wheel drive. Now, we have all-wheel drive as an option open to us now in the mid-80s, but we're not going to be selecting that for this car. Just to take a look at the engine, in case you missed that video, it comes in with 71.3 horsepower and 79.1 foot-pounds of torque. Just to give you kind of a look at what kind of power we're getting out of this engine. Okay, so we already kind of discussed where the numbers are and how, there's seemingly been a change in calculation, but let's go ahead and look at our gearbox setup. Okay, so as far as the way the gearbox was set up, I went with a 5-speed gearbox, and I set up my 5th gear front economy gear, so I set my top speed to correspond with that. And I set the spacing pretty aggressive as we didn't have as much wheel spin with this little bit lower powered engine than I usually contend with, so we could go a little bit more aggressive here. And even still, we're pretty pokey on the 0 to 62 time, and I already kind of discussed that our miles per gallon seemed like that there was some calculation changes there, I think, and this is a lot lower than I would have expected out of this engine. Now, one thing I'd like to discuss here is I talked about in my more recent vlog and automation a little bit, and I don't know if I agree with some of my opinions that I expressed in that vlog as much anymore, kind of reflecting back on things. And honestly, I kind of did that video last minute, and it was unscripted, and it was kind of a little bit rushed. And I didn't really have as much time to think about what I wanted to say, and I didn't really think through as much as what I was going to say, and I honestly probably should have, because what I said, reflecting on things and actually sitting down and reviewing information and looking at things, I don't really agree 100% with. And one of the main things I said was I didn't think the tire width setup was very realistic. And that was me, I think, just misremembering, the numbers and things, and that was just me making a mistake there, and I don't really necessarily agree with that. What I was trying to say, I think, is that there was a tendency for you to have to set up your tire width to be a little bit more on the unrealistic side to contend with wheel spin. And I think the main thing that I was trying to say is I had an issue with wheel spin, and a lot of that was seen in my Shooting Star video, where I really had a problem with the Shooting Star, and that I was, having something around 20% wheel spin, and I was still having really pokey 0 to 62 times. And I wasn't too happy with the way I was having to set up my gearbox to try and contend with that wheel spin. And I did all kinds of other things to try and contend with that wheel spin, giving myself a viscous LSD, setting it up with, sports compound tires, and still the wheel spin was out of control. And I still am of that opinion that I think wheel spin definitely needs some tweaks, so that it needs to reduce, in my opinion, because I think a lot of times you end up having to set up your gearboxes in a real unrealistic ways, having very, very, very long first gears that really kill your acceleration. And, as a result, you have a powerful V8 that just can't get the 0 to 62 times that you can expect. I mean, I'm not going to say that the 0 to 62 times I got with the Shooting Star were atrocious, but they're definitely not what I was looking for. But in any case, I think that's about as much as I want to talk about that. We might talk about it a little bit more when we're looking at the 2.2 liter version, as wheel spin's a little bit more of an issue with that. But just to demonstrate what I mean by that and why I think it's such an issue. So if I increase my spacing even 1 point, we go up to 1.4% wheel spin, which honestly you'd think isn't that bad. But look at the difference in how it affected my drivability and sportiness. It went from 44.7 down to 43.8, almost a full point of loss. And we lose pretty much 0.4 in our sportiness. We also lose in prestige, but it's nothing meaningful. But the main thing that we're seeing here is we lose drivability pretty hard. Now, if I even increase this just another point, we jump up to 4.4% wheel spin. Now, I was able to drop down my 0 to 62 time, but not by very much, only a tenth of a second. But as a result, I lose yet still more drivability, dropping down another 0.4 points. I also lose in sportiness and prestige, but again, nothing meaningful. And we see how much of a detrimental effect this has when you have any amount of wheel spin at all. And the main reason I think this is a major issue is because how do we evaluate cars? We mostly evaluate them in the stats that we're given here. And how do we think the game's going to evaluate these cars? And that's going to be these stats, right? I mean, that's the conclusion I'm coming away with. I'm going to assume, by the way that these stats are calculated, that the game is going to consider these stats over anything else. So these 0 to 62 times might be a factor, but I think the main factor here is going to be these numbers here. And if something is hurting these numbers, what incentive do I have, to set it up in that way, to give myself a good 0 to 62 time if it's hurting everything else? So that's kind of why I think it's a major issue and why I discuss it. Okay, so getting back to the tire widths, I ended up setting these up with 175 millimeter tires, which I think are pretty realistic for this size of car. Whether or not it's realistic for this time period, it's hard to say. Mostly over time, you see a dynamic where you have rim diameters increase in modern times, and you have lower profile tires in modern times. In the past, you would have had smaller rim diameters and more high profile tires. And tire widths, I'm not so sure they changed as much. Way back in the past, you would have had skinnier tires, obviously. But I think at a certain point, I don't know if the tire width changes as much as you see with the rim diameters. That's obviously much more of a change. Maybe a slight change, but I would say not a whole lot. So I don't think this is too unrealistic of a tire width for this style of car. Obviously, having them be wider would take care of a little bit of wheel spin, so we could go for maybe a little bit more aggressive gear spacing and get that 0 to 62 time down. We also have to consider that it increases weight, which is going to hurt 0 to 62 times, though. So I ended up going with medium compound road, 14-inch rims, 175 millimeters, as I already discussed. I didn't do any rim offset. I didn't even try it. I actually stayed away from it because I wasn't sure, again, how buggy this still is. And it was working, so I stuck with what seemingly was working. Steel rims. Now, the brakes, I went with the solid two-piston in the front, which has kind of been the hallmark of my company, as well as drums in the rear. I went with neutral pad types as I didn't want to go with too aggressive, but we do see brake fade. Now, again, when I talked about that brake fade, I think in the previous version of this game, if I had built this car in that version, that I wouldn't be seeing any brake fade at all right now. I think since that change with the pad type affecting brake fade's a little bit harsher than it used to be. But I don't think changing the pad type to match, though, would be very appropriate for this car. So I just keep them a little bit more on the neutral end. Moving along with the cooling airflow, or aerodynamics in general, and with fully clad, reduce that wing angle down to 0. We don't have a wing, so I don't really see. I get rid of that when I don't. And I just went with about 10 over what's required cooling. That's my usual standard. So we got 46.7 as our cooling, required about 35.8. For the interior, I went with 5 seats. I went with standard interior, standard cassette. Now we have cassettes, ooh la la. And power steering, which has been standard for the Luna since its very beginning, and standard 80s safety. With suspension setup, I went standard, twin tube dampers, and passive sway bars, as it's the only choice anyway. Twin tube to keep the cost low, obviously, and standard, that's pretty much the best setup for this. I went to normal preset, which is usually a good baseline for any of the, I would say more normal or, cars like this. But I ended up stiffening up the spring stiffness both in front and rear. It was definitely softer than this with the normal preset, and I stiffened up the dampers quite a bit. I don't think I did much with the sway bars, but ride height did go up a little bit to get rid of bottom out. And that's pretty much it for the car. So let's go ahead and look at detailed stats here, and I'm just going to go through this very briefly, and if you want to see anything in detail, just pause. So we just saw drivability, so sportiness, comfort, prestige, and finally safety. Okay, let's look at our test track. Now, we already talked about how this is kind of pokey with the 0 to 62 time. Top speed comes in at 105.3. Now, one thing that was interesting that I saw is that the weight distribution is pretty even in this car, which is pretty nice. And cornering wise, I wouldn't say this is spectacular, but it's also not bad either. Seeing how I've already done this, build off camera, I kind of know what times to expect. And unfortunately, this trim doesn't get better than the 1 minute 50 time that I usually look for. So let's go ahead and run that and see it. All right, so with that brief run, we come in with 1 minute 51.92, almost 1 minute 52. Not particularly good, honestly, but it is not that powerful of a car. I mean, engine. So it is what it is. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the 2.2 standard 2.2 with the manual transmission, so we can see how it differs. So let's go ahead and just jump. Well, I better show the engine so we can see the difference here. So the engine comes in with 89.4 horsepower, almost 90, and 105 foot-pounds of torque. Now for the trim, the gearbox is kind of set up to match the... and is it not giving me the full graphs here? I don't think it is. Let's just recalculate and maybe come back. There we go. Okay. So the gearbox was set up more or less for the engine. So top speed's probably greater than it was before to contend with the more power. Again, fifth gear being our economy gear setup. Obviously, we see the direct comparison with our previous model. So we got a little bit better drivability, sportiness. Not quite as good comfort, but prestige and safety is also better. But I'm going to assume weight is higher, which is why we got the safety. Obviously, our miles per gallon dropped, but our 0 to 62 time definitely improved quite a bit. But due to this being a higher power engine, I had to drop that spacing down and make it a lot less aggressive to deal with that wheel spin. As I improve this even one, you have 2%, which drops me down more than a point in drivability. If we go up another one, we jump up to 8.2%. You see how fast this wheel spin gets out of control, and that drops us down yet another point, down to 43.4. So you see how much of a detrimental effect this wheel spin can have on us, and why you want to kind of get rid of it if you're really concerned with having your stats be as good as they can be. And, that's what I'm kind of talking about, having to go a lot less aggressive. And, and with the Shooting Star, for instance, I mean, my first gear was probably practically out to what, 70-ish miles an hour practically to, that doesn't sound good. And I think when we did that video, when I did the test track, I actually counted how many seconds it took for the thing to even start revving, and it was like something like 4 or 5 seconds, which is not good. I mean, when you have that long of a first gear, essentially it takes a lot longer for you to get into your power band where your real power comes in, and that's where you want to keep in. That's the whole point of having a gearbox, a multi-speed gearbox, is you're trying to keep yourself within that power band as long as possible with your gearbox. So every time you change gears, the idea is that you're going to keep it in that power band where your power is. For it to take that long to get up into that power band with such a long gear, it's not really a good thing, especially for your acceleration numbers. Okay, so more or less everything else is going to be the same. When I do a model, I like to keep the trims more or less the same unless there's a real valid reason of changing something up. So this is going to be exactly the same as we saw before. And brakes are going to be exactly the same. Now we do see a bit more brake fade here, obviously, as we're demanding more out of the brakes. Cooling airflow is the only thing that's really going to change because obviously this engine needs more cooling airflow, so we went with roughly 10 above what the engine requires. Again, interior is exactly the same. Now suspension's a little bit different due to differences in weight dynamics, so there is changes here. But more or less, it is pretty close to the same. And now we're going to go ahead and look at our detailed stats. So we've got drivability, sportiness, comfort, prestige, safety, and finally our test track. So we already saw what our 0 to 62 time was like. Now top speed comes up to 113.6. Our weight goes a little bit front heavy, but not by much. And it looks like we lost a little bit in cornering here, but not a whole lot. So it doesn't handle quite as good. But I'm going to expect this to be a lot better around the track. So let's go ahead and do that. And just to keep things brief, I'm not gonna go too long into the track runs. But in any case, our track time comes in at 1 minute 48.07, which shaves, well over 3 seconds, almost 4 seconds off of the time that we got before. So pretty drastic change from our previous trim. So let's go ahead and hop into our automatic versions. Now, after I did this build, I kind of thought about things, and I'm not so sure how much I agree with the way that I set up the gearbox here. But, it could go both ways. I've been thinking about this, and one thing that we have is we're getting a lot better economy, a lot better economy out of this 4-speed automatic than we would get out of our 5-speed manual, which is honestly not keeping with reality. Most of the time, manual transmissions are going to be better in the economy numbers than an automatic, usually speaking, especially when you have more gears to work with. But at the same token, what I could have done differently, rather than have the fourth gear be mostly an economy gear, I could have had all 4 gears just be acceleration gears going right up to the top speed. But the downside of that would be that I would have a lot harder time contending with that wheel spin, and the spacing would have really had to be a lot lower than it is now. Right now, it's pretty aggressive, and it's pretty aggressive because we have a very slow 0 to 62 time here. And I made it about as aggressive as I could without getting wheel spin. And as a matter of fact, it looks like we could go even more aggressive than that. But it started getting kind of to a point where I kind of stopped because I didn't want to go too aggressive with that gearbox. But I probably could have gone more aggressive to get this 0 to 62 time down. But I kind of got it where I wanted it. But as we can expect, this is going to be a lot slower than before. I mean, we're seeing a lot slower 0 to 62 time, but we're seeing better economy as a result. But obviously, and one thing I did notice is I didn't know if this had a tooltip before, but I am noticing it has a tooltip now. Now, it might have, and I just didn't notice it. But it essentially shows you the difference between a manual and automatic transmission. But honestly, I assumed a lot of these differences anyway, and we're being proven correct with what we're seeing here. But the other thing I'm noticing, though, is that we notice that the weight and cost and production units are exactly the same, which is not something I agree with, honestly. But that's my own opinion, and you can, form your own opinions, obviously, on that. But for drivability's sake, I mean, obviously, we have a lot better than we were getting out of our manual transmission cars. But as we see that dynamic there, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so moving along, beyond the gearbox setup, you can pretty much expect the exact kind of setup that we had before. So wheels are exactly the same, brakes are exactly the same. Brake fade's a little bit better because I think the car might be slightly lighter, even though because the 5-speed down to a 4-speed will be lighter. So yeah, it's a little bit lighter, so a little bit less brake fade there. Cooling airflow, pretty much the same. Interior the same, suspension the same as our 1.6 liter. So mostly what we're going to be looking at here after we do our detailed stats. So we have drivability, we have sportiness, we have comfort, we have prestige, we have safety, and now we can look at our test track. So we already talked about our 0 to 62 time. We also have our top speed, which comes up under 100 miles an hour, which is honestly, in my opinion, not all that great. I would like to see cars of this type at least get over the 100 mile an hour hump. Weight distribution we see is probably the best we've seen as far as the even distribution. Cornering Gs look about the same as they were in the other 1.6 variant. So let's go ahead and do our time. And again, I'm going to keep this brief. I'm pretty much going to stop it right away. And we see this is by and far the slowest car on the planet, well, at least of these trims. So we've got 1 minute 55 dead, and again, a lot slower. We're pretty much adding on 3 seconds from our manual transmission variant. But obviously, as I said, I could have gone more aggressive with that gearbox and gotten that time a little bit quicker, the 0 to 62 time, which would have helped there. So we go to our 2.2. engined automatic. We're just going to pop right into here. So again, automatic transmission, more or less set up roughly the same way that the 1.6 automatic was. I went a little bit more aggressive with the spacing. So, I could have done the same with the 1.6. We do see that the 0-62 time is faster than it was in the 1.6 manual, but obviously a lot slower than the 2.2 manual. And we see also better fuel economy than the 2.2 manual, and we see our stats here. Moving along, though, not a whole lot else has changed outside of this gearbox. So again, tires the same, brakes the same, airflow the same. I'm not sure why the graphs aren't popping up. Interior the same, suspension the same. And finally, let's go ahead and go to a detailed stats. So we have drivability, we have sportiness, we have comfort, we have prestige, and finally safety. Let's hop into our test track. Now we are getting above that top 100 miles an hour top speed with this version, 109.4. Cornering G's look about the same as they were with the other 2.2 variant. So let's go ahead and run things. Again, stop this pretty much right away. So we're not quite getting under that 1 minute 50 time, 1 minute 50.73, which is kind of disappointing, but it is what it is. As I said, I could probably go more aggressive with this this gearbox setup. Let's see if we get any wheel spin if I go any more aggressive. No, so we obviously could go more aggressive. I just kind of got to a point where I stopped. But in any case, that's pretty much it. I'm not going to show the premium trim version. Just imagine this car, but slower because of the premium trims. And obviously, they're going to be stat effects because of that premium trims. I also slapped ABS on the premium version. And I mostly just made the premium trim version because I made a premium trim version in 81. I don't know if the premium trim would be appropriate for this car model, but as I said, I made it for comparison's sake. So let's go ahead and jump into our comparison here. And let's sort things so we can actually find what we're looking for. And I know I opened up the 86 Luna. I don't think I opened up the 81 Luna, so there we go. So we're going to look at our direct comparison. So again, as I talked about, these stats dropped down quite a bit when I just went through and I guess got that recalculation going. And what I can see just briefly looking here, I got better numbers in 86 than I got in 81 pretty much across the board. The only exception I see to that is it looks like we got better production unit times, but we have more costs though, comparing directly. So the premium versus premium, we're a couple hundred more, almost 300 more. Same dynamic with the, for instance, standard 1.6 versus the other standard 1.6. We're a little less than 200 more expensive. So it's definitely more expensive, but production unit time is down. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but it is. As far as everything else, though, as I said, pretty much across the board, better. Except for economy, which is pretty much the same. The only example that I see that's different is the 2.2 or the 135 variant. And the 81 Luna looks like it got a little bit less economy than our version in the 86. So we did a little bit of improvement there. The one thing that I do take away from this, and it looks like we got the same results in 81, is that the 2.2 liter version has better drivability than the 1.6 liter version, which is kind of weird. I wouldn't have expected that, but I think that's how the drivability stat is derived, has something to do with that. I think it has something to do with like a circle, there's like a track test that it does, like a circle track test, and it does weigh the time that test takes as part of your drivability stat. So that might be part of the reason why you have a little bit more power there. In any case, that's pretty much that. So this video is a little bit shorter than usually these car build videos are, because I did most of the building off camera and we just kind of went over all the details. But at the same time, we got to talk about some things that I wanted to talk about. And, I guess I can kind of... I got to come clean on some of the things I talked about in the vlog that maybe I made a little bit of a mistake talking about and you know, I think it was important for me to talk about. In any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. This is Mouse Gunner signing out.